so clearly true as the truth of democracy. Of course, being clearly true, or as Thomas Jefferson might have put it, self-evident, did not mean that everybody applauded it or assented to it in Lincoln's lifetime. Democracy had a long history, and not all of it was admirable. Classical Athens may be said to have been the pilot program for democracy, beginning in the 6th century BC, when the ordinary citizens of Athens saved their city from occupation by the forces of Sparta and lodged political power in the hands of the city assembly. But many of the shrewdest of Athenian thinkers, Thucydides, the historian, Plato, the philosopher, were skeptical about turning over control of the city to what often behaved like a mob. Plato never allowed Athenians to be forgiven for executing his teacher, Socrates, and he was convinced that most people have no knowledge of true being and have no clear patterns in their mind of justice, beauty, and truth. Who wanted a democracy on those terms? The French Revolution did not give democracy a better reputation, especially after it descended into the reign of terror, and revealed what Ruth Shaw has called the uneasy coincidence of democracy and fanaticism. The restored European monarchies of Lincoln's day, having learnt the hard way about the lessons of the guillotine, had scant use for democracy. And even the least monarchical of all the monarchies, that of Great Britain, was nevertheless governed by a deeply entrenched aristocracy whose members would continue to constitute a majority of every ministerial cabinet until 1906. Nevertheless, for Lincoln, democracy was what the great Austrian political scientist Hans Kelsen called a generally recognized value. And his loyalty to democracy was what armed him to combat the spread of human slavery in the United States. Even though democracy is a political system and slavery is an economic system, Lincoln believed that they were at death's grip with each other. As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master, he wrote in 1858. This expresses my idea of democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. So when the treacherous and thunderous cloud of Civil War broke over his presidency, Lincoln had no hesitation in portraying the struggle as a contest not just over constitutional interpretation or even over slavery itself, but over the basic principle of democracy. The fundamental notion of any democracy is that political sovereignty resides in the people. It's understood to rest with the people. Now, strictly speaking, this differs from a republic. In a republic, sovereignty, yes, is also understood to rest ultimately in the hands of the people, but it's deployed through their representatives. A pure democracy, wrote James Madison in the 10th of the Federalist Papers, can only be a society consisting of a small number of persons who assemble and administer the government in person. A republic, said Madison, is a government in which the scheme of representation takes place, and it involves the delegation of the government to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. Madison understood this process of delegation in a republic as a kind of purifying process. It served, he said, to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom can best discern the true interest of their country. In other words, republics mistrust democracy, or at least they mistrust the run-of-the-mill of the people who compose democracies. Republics envision a role for a more elevated elite who can do for the people what the people ought to do, but often don't. The American founders understood themselves in creating a republic. Even the most rousing of the revolutionary rabble-rousers, Tom Paine, never even uses the term democracy in his famous broadside against monarchy, Common Sense, in 1776. And yet it was clear during the Revolution that the line between a democracy and a republic was a porous one. In 1777, Alexander Hamilton praised the new revolutionary Constitution of New York as a representative democracy, thus mingling the two concepts, democracy, representation. Because, he said, the right of election is well secured and regulated, and the exercise of the legislature, executive, and judiciary authorities is vested in select persons, but persons chosen really and not nominally by the people. Half a century later, republicanism and democracy had fused. The 1787 Constitution created a system of delegated representation that captured perfectly the idea of a republic, but there was no class of cultured or natural elites who emerged from the mass of the people to obligingly serve as their representatives. And no wonder. The freedom that Americans enjoyed from entanglement in European wars eliminated any possibility of the formation of a professional military elite. And the prevalence of evangelical Protestant religion undermined any notion of social hierarchy. By the time Alexis de Tocqueville arrived in America in the 1830s to begin his classic analysis of American political society, Republican was still the noun, but democratic had become the adjective. And the adjective so controlled the noun that it only made sense for Tocqueville to entitle his study Democracy in America. Democracy, not republicanism. A democratic republic subsists in the United States, Tocqueville wrote. The country's sheer size and the preference Americans had for commerce rather than politics made an indirect system of representation desirable, but the internal spirit of that system would be highly democratic. And this, largely because the American people, he said, have a taste for freedom and the art of being free. And they don't need to have their views refined and enlarged by others. It is in those tastes, Tocqueville called them mores, that make what was designed as a republic work as a democracy in a more or less regulated and prosperous fashion, Tocqueville said. So when Lincoln spoke of democracy, he was speaking of a republican system in which democratic habits had become so pervasive that they reversed the usual flow of republicanism. Instead of representatives restraining the wildness of the people themselves set the limits on what the representatives could do. By the frame of government under which we live, this same people have wisely given their public servants but little power for mischief, Lincoln said. And they have, with equal wisdom, provided for the return of that little to their own hands at very short intervals. Under the canopy of democracy, the people are judged competent to direct their own lives, public and private, without needing or wanting the paternal tyranny and direction of aristocrats and monarchs, or even the meddlesome oversight of the wealthy and the learned. The legitimate object of government, Lincoln wrote in 1854, is to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done, but cannot do at all or cannot so well do for themselves in their separate and individual capacities. In all that the people can individually do as well for themselves, government ought not to interfere. The purpose of government, Lincoln said, was not to organize or stratify or stabilize the people, but simply to level the playing field, to guarantee what he called an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life by securing equality before the laws. So government's principal usefulness, government's principal utility, was to maximize personal transformation, to lift, as he said, artificial weights from all shoulders, and to clear the paths of laudable pursuit for all. Now, in such a community, in a democratized republic, two voices have to be obeyed as with iron rods. First of all, the rule of the majority. Whatever principles and policies are endorsed by the majority of that people must become the principles and policies of their government. Otherwise, the sovereignty of the people means nothing. If the majority does not control, the minority must. Would that be right? Lincoln asked. Would that be just or generous? Assuredly not. By the same measure, the minority who have disagreed must acquiesce in the majority's rule. If the minority will not acquiesce, Lincoln concluded, the majority must, or the government must cease. What was worse, an unbowed minority could make a precedent for themselves, which in turn will divide and ruin them. For a minority of their own will secede from them whenever disagreement breaks out. The long-term result, and truth be told, it will not be a very long term, will be either anarchy or despotism. Sovereignty will either evaporate as each separate faction or individual does what is right in their own eyes, or else, in desperation, decent people will turn to a dictator to sort out the chaos. The rule of a minority as a permanent arrangement is wholly inadmissible, Lincoln said. So that, rejecting the majority principle, anarchy or despotism in some form is all that is left. That was why the Civil War was what Lincoln called essentially a people's contest. The Confederate rebellion was an assault by a minority on the decision of the majority, as expressed in Lincoln's own election. And in that way, the Confederacy was really intended to question the entire basic principle of democracy itself. The second thing that Lincoln believed must rule in a democracy is the legitimacy of the minority. No majority is perfectly infallible simply for being a majority. In a democracy, the habit of self-interest, persuasion, reason, and civility guarantee that a minority may cling to its opinion and use every legitimate opportunity to convince others that they are right. We should remember, Lincoln cautioned his own allies once he became president, that while we exercise our opinion, others have also rights to the exercise of their opinions. And we should endeavor to allow these rights and act in such a manner as to create no bad feeling. It is the mark of a dictator, not a democracy, to treat dissenters as a social enemy, to be put up against the barn wall and shot, or, as in the case of the Confederate rebellion, for a minority to attempt to bully a majority, to engage in pressing out of view the rights of men and the authority of the people. There was, in Lincoln's idea of democracy, no need for firing squads to conclude arguments. I do not deny the possibility that the people may err in an election, Lincoln admitted in 1861, but if they do, the true cure is in the next election. To set aside those rules, those two rules, whether out of weakness or confusion, was to cast doubt on whether democracy really had any legitimacy whatsoever. The challenge of the Confederate rebellion was not directed solely at him or his party or his administration. It presented, Lincoln said, to the whole family of man the question whether a constitutional republic or a democracy, a government of the people by the same people, can or cannot survive the push and shove of its own people's disagreements, or whether democracies are doomed forever to fly off by their own centrifugal force into fragments. For my part, he told his secretary John Hay in May of 1861, I consider the central idea pervading this struggle as the necessity that is upon us in proving that popular government of the people, is not an absurdity. We must settle this question now, whether in a free government the minority have the right to break up the government whenever they choose. If we fail, it will go far to prove the incapability of the people to govern themselves. Or as he would put it more eloquently at Gettysburg in November of 1863, the war was testing whether this nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. If those two rules are the basic operating system of a democracy, then we should also notice that these two rules also require rules of their own to operate rightly. First of all, democracy operates best within the boundaries of a nation state. This is not a concept that in an increasingly globalized world economy meets with much enthusiasm today. But the nation state actually provides the only effective means of identifying who belongs to a certain democratic entity, which is to say, its citizens. And by contrast, who is an interloper and not subject to its restraints, and who might harm it with impunity. Second, within that nation state, there should be a reasonably broad franchise. In other words, almost all adults within its boundaries should be entitled to vote and to hold office. Third, voting should be without coercion or manipulation. Fourth, citizens may organize themselves into political associations of their own choosing for accomplishing those goals. And then fifth, political information must be permitted to circulate freely and without hindrance among the citizens. Now, having laid down these 5 secondary rules for how a democracy operates, it won't take a whole lot of insight to see that the Confederacy formed as much a threat to these democratic rules as it did to the 2 basic operating rules. To begin with, the Confederacy did not exhibit a reasonably broad franchise, and had not for years, even for its white population. In the 11 states that would form the Confederacy, only one of them, Tennessee, showed voter participation higher than the national average in the 1852 presidential election. The rest showed voter participation down 15 percentage points lower than the national average, and in some cases lower by 20% than in the free states. A pro-secession propagandist like Edmund Ruffin, frankly, deplored his own Virginia legislature as that despicable assembly. Why? Because the enlargement of the constituency based on universal suffrage. Yeah, there was a real rousing endorsement of democracy. By the same token, the Confederacy did not permit free and full discussion of issues, because its political life was marked by nothing as much as the suppression of free speech and the control of the circulation of free political information. In 1835, the Postmaster General, Amos Kendall, refused to protect the distribution of anti-slavery materials through Southern post offices in terms eerily reminiscent of cancel culture. Because, Kendall said, we owe an obligation to the laws, but a higher one to the communities in which we live. And these communities demanded censorship to save them from offense. In truth, the Confederacy had lost all grip on democracy. It had become an oligarchy, managed by a handful of slave-owning elites. Society is a pyramid, explained the editor of the Nashville Daily Gazette late in 1860. We may sympathize with the stones at the bottom of the pyramid of Cheops, but we know that some stones have to be at the bottom, that they must be permanent in their place. Too bad for them. The stones in this case were slaves, and it makes you wonder. No surprise that James Madison feared slavery as the oligarchic snake in the American garden. Since the classical republics, whose vices he had studied, had demonstrated all too well that in proportion as slavery prevails in a state, the government, however democratic in name, must be aristocratic in fact. At every point, the Confederacy had failed the democratic test. Yet, the Confederacy was also a chilling example for us, as much as for Lincoln, of how easily a democratic republic can slide backwards into coercion and hierarchy. For the realization that haunted Lincoln was that democracies tend to become, like Thomas Hobbes's definition of life, nasty, poor, mean, brutish, and short. Especially short. Most human societies had maintained order either by coercion or superstition, and the few which had not done so, sooner or later succumbed to the fear of anarchy and welcomed Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar to create order. At the very beginning of his political career, Lincoln had feared this was about to overtake American democracy. In his first major political speech, the Lyceum Address of January 1838, Lincoln was convinced that Americans were in real danger of political self-destruction, since the tsunami of mob actions in the previous year looked so destabilizing that Americans might be tempted, he said, to look to some towering genius who thirsts and burns for distinction to save them from a government that offers them no protection. Once installed, people tolerated the rule of Alexander and Caesar, not only because they promised law and order, but because, and Lincoln did not explore this in 1838, because they dispensed patronage and deployed favoritism. This was not the prettiest glue a society could use to hold itself together, and it frequently descended into corruption, but patronage and favoritism worked in their own oppressive way. Democracies would need social glue as well. But the glue which the American founders hoped to apply was virtue. If Americans could be persuaded to deny themselves, to place the public interest first, and to govern with a view to truth, even to their own personal harm, then, they were confident, the United States would prosper. Self-government in a nation could only flourish in an atmosphere of personal self-government, supported, as John Adams insisted in 1776, by pure religion or austere morals. Public virtue cannot exist in a nation without private virtue. The problem with virtue was that it demanded more of people than they might be willing to give. In the same year that Americans declared their independence, Adam Smith declared in The Wealth of Nations that It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard for their own self-interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. By 1787, there were a good many sadder but wiser Americans who agreed the only way to make the American Republic work was by appeals to self-interest. Individuals of extended views and of national pride may bring the public proceedings to the standard of virtue, complained James Madison, but the example will never be followed by the multitude. What was true in economics was true in politics. The real governor of human behavior was self-interest, not virtue. If men were angels, no government would be necessary, Madison conceded. But they weren't. And so, Madison said, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. But if virtue was difficult for democracies to practice, wasn't self-interest toxic? And did that explain why democracies were so short-lived? Abraham Lincoln believed as profoundly in self-interest as Adam Smith. We have been mistaken all of our lives if we do not know that everybody you trade with makes something. Lincoln maintained that there was no conscious act of any man that was not moved by a motive, first, last, and always, wrote William Henry Herndon, his old law partner. Even when Lincoln was arguing for the recruitment of blacks as Union soldiers, he framed the argument in terms of self-interest rather than virtue. Negroes, like other people, act upon motives, Lincoln reasoned. Why should they do anything for us if we will do nothing for them? But he did not believe that self-interest alone could sustain a democracy. Even Madison had constrained political self-interest by the Constitution's separation of powers. Lincoln believed that there was a natural law in morals which restrained self-interest in democracy. In any question of policy, then, let us be brought to believe it is morally right. But at the same time, he added, let us believe that it is favorable to, or at least not against, our interest. It was slavery, he believed, which insisted that there is no right principle of action but self-interest. Slavery was the instrument of men based only on temporary self-interest. So as much as Lincoln believed that self-interest was too instinctive a role in human society to deny completely, he also believed that there was a circle to be drawn around certain tenets of natural law which neither self-interest nor majorities could invade. And nothing showed this to better effect than the series of debates Lincoln held with Stephen A. Douglas during the campaign for the senior U.S. Senate seat from Illinois in 1858. For Stephen Douglas, democracy really was simple majoritarianism. Whatever 51% of the people wanted for the nation ought to be the rule. What mattered most in Douglas's mind was process, whether the rules of counting the majority had been properly observed. Once that requirement was satisfied, Douglas cared not at all whether slavery was, as he said, voted up or voted down in the territories. Let the voice of the people rule. This is an example of what the political scientist Michael Sandel has called the procedural republic, which treats its citizens strictly as independent individuals who have rights. Since in Douglas's reasoning, slave owning was a constitutionally guaranteed and morally neutral right, it was no business of anyone in the 5 states or the free states to interfere with the free exercise of that right. Lincoln represented an entirely different perspective. Democracy was not about helping people exercise rights apart from doing what was right. And even if slavery was legal by certain state laws, it was nevertheless a clear violation of natural law. No majority of 51% or any other percent had the power to reverse natural law, and certainly not the natural laws Lincoln could find written in the Declaration of Independence about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or in physical nature and the instinctive resistance of the humblest creatures to oppression and exploitation by members of their own species. Lincoln said, the ant who has toiled and dragged a crumb to his nest will furiously defend the fruit of his labor against whatever robber assails him. That made the wrong of human slavery so plain that the most dumb and stupid slave that ever toiled for a master does constantly know that he is wronged. In the face of Douglas's belief that democracy existed only to provide a procedural framework for having a good time and getting your way, Lincoln insisted that democracy had a higher purpose, which was the realization of a morally right political order. For Douglas, democracy was an end in itself. For Lincoln, democracy was a means rather than an end, a means in political life for realizing the natural ends for which human beings were made. Natural law has been a source of restraint and appeal over the centuries, for centuries before Lincoln and in Lincoln's own time. And the audiences that he appealed to in 1858 understood what he was talking about, even if they balked at his application of it to slavery. In 1859, all of that fell to pieces. Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, published in November of 1859, set out a vision of a world system from which all laws, except that of self-interest, were fully and finally banished. Lincoln died before the full effect of Darwin's ideas could draw any form of comment from him. But the democratic project that Lincoln felt was a full and satisfactory statement of the truth of human nature could, after Darwin, no longer justify itself in any terms other than the simple satisfaction of human demands. And in that case, monarchies, oligarchies, dictatorships might serve these ends just as well as democracy. World War I's aftermath saw Europeans plunge into an orgy of constitution making, seeking to replace the dynasties toppled by the war, the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollerns, the Romanovs, the Sultans, with a world made safe for democracy, only to see those democracies bereft of any moral law and therefore crumble and collapse before more insidious but also more effective appeals to self-interest. And even when, in 1989, democracy achieved its most notable victory in the collapse of the Soviet Union and its empire, it still managed, as Paul Berman wrote in Terror and Liberalism, in its pure version to seem mediocre, corrupt, tired, and aimless, a middling compromise, pale and unappealing, something to settle for in the spirit of resignation. By contrast, Lincoln was not nearly so limp in his embrace of democracy. Self-interest has a role to play, but so does confidence in the moral right. And yet even that confidence had to obey the iron rod of democracy's operating rules. Right without law was little better than Douglas's law without right, or even lawlessness itself. And Lincoln did not believe that democracy could survive without both a determined advocacy of natural right and an equally determined acquiescence to the rule of law. When his earnest Treasury Secretary, Salmon Chase, urged him to step beyond the Emancipation Proclamation and unilaterally emancipate all slaves everywhere in the United States, rather than in just the Confederacy, Lincoln replied with a sharp reminder that this unilateralism, even in the name of freedom, was exactly what put democracy in danger. If I take the step, Lincoln argued, must I not do so without the argument of military necessity, and so without any argument except the one that I think the measure politically expedient and morally right? Would I not thus give up all footing upon constitution or law? Would I not thus be in the boundless field of absolutism? The question before us today is whether the confidence Lincoln reposed in democracy is still possible. In our universities, critical theory tells us that just as all biological entities reduce to survival, all human relationships reduce to power. So that what calls itself democracy is really only a linguistic cloak for the same power employed by dictatorships. In our streets, what Lincoln would have at once recognized as his old nemesis, that lawless and mobocratic spirit, spreading with rapid and fearful impetuosity to the ultimate overthrow of every institution or even moral principle, that spirit insists that it, and not the laws, is the vehicle of justice. Even in the halls of Congress, a sitting U.S. senator announces that democracy is unnatural and that we don't run anything important in our lives by democratic vote other than our government. So it's illogical to think it would be permanent. It will fall apart at some point, and maybe that isn't now, but maybe it is. These are words we have not heard since 1860. And they appall us with the thought that the ghosts of 1860 have reappeared on the stage of our public life to try us once again, to challenge democracy. Where then shall we find an antidote to this pessimism about the democratic future? When he spoke to the Wisconsin State Agricultural Fair in 1859, Lincoln described what he called an Eastern monarch, something like one of the characters that we can find in some of these paintings here in the gallery. An Eastern monarch who charged his wise men to invent him a sentence which should be true in all times and situations. Well, they went away, they thought for a while, they debated among themselves, and then they came back. They had formulated exactly such a sentence that would be true at all times and in all places and in all situations, and it ran like this: "And this too shall pass away." This was, Lincoln acknowledged, a useful saying, consoling in the depths of affliction. But he did not want it to be the epitaph of democracy. Let us hope it is not quite true, he continued. Let us hope, rather, that by the best cultivation of the physical world beneath and around us, and the intellectual and moral world within us, we shall secure an individual, social, and political prosperity and happiness whose course shall be onward and upward, and which, while the earth endures, shall not pass away. To which I, for one, can only say, let it be so. Thank you very much. Now, if I'm reading Mark's gestures to me correctly, we have arrived at question time. Now, am I allowed